Welcome and thank you for joining us today. I am delighted to introduce our webinar talking about our generation, balancing the interests of rising and current generations of wealth-owning families, which is brought to you by STEP's Responsible Stewardship of Wealth Thought Leadership Strategy Group. Before we kick off, I have some brief housekeeping notes to run through. All attendees have had their microphones and videos disabled for the duration of the webinar. If you have a question, please use the Q&A function that's located at the bottom of your screen. We'll be taking questions throughout the presentation as well as at the end, so please do drop them in as they come to you. And we are recording this session, so there will be a link that's sent to you and available for you to watch it on demand from tomorrow. I'd like to give a big shout out to our sponsors, the Alzheimer's Society, Dell Tech Bank, and the TMF Group. Before I kick off, I just would like to introduce myself. My name is Gina Pereira. It's my genuine pleasure to introduce today's speakers, Garvin Brown, Dr. Inika Cooley, and John Riches. But before I hand over the podium to them, I'd just like to take a minute to set the scene. You heard a clip at the beginning of the 1965 Who song, My Generation, which became an anthem for youth. This song was a cultural marker of the turbulent and transformative 1960s, where social norms were being questioned and reshaped by a rising generation. Unbelievably, we're now nearly 6 decades on, and observing rising generations questioning systems of power, and in particular, the purpose of wealth and approaches to wealth planning, perhaps in part driven by climate crises and massive economic disparities of wealth that have been highlighted during the pandemic. The shifting tide is demonstrated in organized social movements such as the Good Ancestor movement and the Patriotic Millionaires. And these changes in attitude can create friction potentially with older generations and more conventional wealth planning structures that have been put in place to hold family wealth. Another common issue that we're seeing in wealth-owning families is that rising generations may feel disconnected. They may be struggling to be heard or to feel like they're performing a meaningful role in the family unit. These different factors can lead to intergenerational conflict, which is arguably one of the greatest threats to the long-term sustainability of a thriving family enterprise. One of the luminaries in the field of family governance and leadership across generations, Dennis Jaffe, observed 3 pathways to successful families. He did note that in his decades of experience, very few families follow all 3 of these pathways, but those who are successful do. The first is that they invest in nurturing the family by creating common vision, purpose, and set of values that facilitate communication, connection, and ultimately build trust. The second pathway is a commitment to establishing an effective stewardship of the family enterprises by putting in place a set of rules, or perhaps you could coin it as a governance framework that determines how decisions are made, how rewards and resources are distributed, and clearly establishes different roles and responsibilities across the family unit. A third way that successful families set themselves up for success is that they invest in cultivating and developing human capital of the next generation by helping them to educate and prepare rising gens, not only to succeed as individuals, but to enable them to have a meaningful role within the family unit and to cultivate an expectation that they will share in the family legacy. So in this panel session, through the model of a business owning family, we're going to explore these issues and how advisors can service wealth owning families to build resilience to survive generational transition. So with that, I'd like to hand over the mic to John. And John, if you would, could you just share your experiences with this topic over the years in which you've been practicing?
Sure, thank you, Inika. Thank you, Gina. Yeah, I think one little marker point I was going to put down at the beginning, and it throws me back, in fact, to a session that Inika and I did many years ago in 2008, is the root of the word governance, which is, I think, quite interesting because it Courtesy of Wikipedia, I found out that in fact it was Plato who first used the word governance in a figurative sense, because it used to mean to steer a ship. So it was kind of like a rudder type idea. So I think framing that in mind, another sort of prefacing point I'd make is that a while back when we were looking at the purpose of STEP, and I think this is a previous expression, we came up with the strap line, the responsible transmission of wealth across generations. And so I think that's sort of partly hinted at in the current sort of strapline for STEP. But I think that the key thing to me, that if we're looking at, well, what does good governance look like, is that any transition of wealth must be in one sense a positive experience, and one that, harking back to what you were saying, Gina, empowers the rising generation to flourish, that preserves family harmony, and that enables wealth to be stewarded. It seems to me those are the sort of goals that need to be kept sort of together. And I would say that good governance is absolutely central to all of those. You could be the best draftsperson, tax advisor, but if you don't get these things right, then you're probably setting up your clients to fail. And I also think that taking a slightly wider look at this is that this isn't just a selfish desire of families to do well. I think there's a huge public policy imperative here that actually seeing good transmission of wealth is actually in the public interest, and in the paradigm that you mentioned, Gina, of family businesses that we work with, for those family businesses to thrive, is not just in the interest of the family, but all of the stakeholders who are connected with those family businesses. So if we take that as a sort of a backdrop to say that good governance is one of the keys, and that I think, as you said, Gina, was borne out by the Jaffe research, then I think the really challenging part thinking about this is that when you think about a rising generation, and obviously for me, having been born in the 60s and a few years old when that song was first written, the challenge that the rising generation faces is that they are processing, as teenagers or young adults, lots of existential questions around what is their place in the world, what are they for, and we all know that tackling that transition ordinarily is a challenge. But when you overlay on that some of the issues that come with being in a wealthy family, with being in a business family, and managing the kind of expectations that may have been absorbed over the dinner table over many years, then I think we have to be realistic and say that this so-called privilege of inheriting wealth and the prospect of that is also something that is a potential constraint. And as you refer to, Gina, I think, the difference in worldviews and values that may be apparent amongst a rising generation means that you can't just sort of slam dunk this thing in and say, well, look, here are our values, we've written them down, just so you know, as the rising generation, if you just sign up here to this set of values, then we can move on. So I think if you pivot the position and say, what is the kind of framework for the senior generation, then it seems to me that the senior generation needs to think about two aligned questions. The first question is the question of allocation of in the transmission of wealth. How is that going to be allocated? And there are obviously recipients here, not just family recipients, but other recipients that may be relevant, not just philanthropic. Alongside that, I think if the allocation decisions the family face are how do you divide up the wealth, how you deal with the business, then the governance questions are, well, who's going to decide? And it doesn't necessarily follow that those two things need to be sort of aligned at the same time. So if we think about what might constitute a good governance framework, then it seems to me that in this sort of openness of culture that Dennis Jaffe referred to, that building a framework that empowers, that opens up the possibility of participation for the rising generation is critical. But it seems to me that you set them up to fail if you make it compulsory. In other words, the option of being participating is important so that they feel included. But the lack of compulsion and the importance of having a framework that either for a period of transition or perhaps indefinitely, if there's a decision not to participate, means that the governance doesn't fall over. And I think it's important to recognize that if you come with this framework of allocation and governance as being potentially distinct, that doesn't mean that someone is disinherited because they won't feel for whatever reason that they're unable to participate in governance. So keeping those two things together, I think, is important. And what I find really interesting in trends, if I sort of can mark this, is that I guess it's a well-known sort of expression to say that entrepreneurs might view sometimes their business as like another child, as another, something that they've nurtured and grown and put a lot of their energy into. And what I seem to detect in recent years amongst a number of particularly sort of first generation entrepreneurs is a kind of move away from a framework of purely dynastic planning, where the assumption is that everything goes down the bloodline, both in terms of governance and inheritance, to a model which is more, not quite social enterprise, but one where the role of the business and its stakeholders has a sort of seat at the table, both in terms of how you framework the recipients but also how you framework the governance. And so if you take that sort of construct, then the sort of governance that you might build would be one where the family and the rising generation have a critical voice, but not the only voice at the table in terms of the governance process. So to me, pulling that all together, good governance is a sort of critical first step. But aligned to that, the whole question of communication and how that's conveyed is very important. And certainly talking to a number of people in the field who focus on this, not just as lawyers, but others, there is a tendency on the part of, I think, advisors and the senior generation to understand or to assume that the rising generation gets this on a first pass. And in my experience, the need to kind of reinforce and keep communicating strongly on this issue is absolutely essential.
What, in your experience, John, do you find family members, their willingness at the different stages of generations to engage in this sort of preliminary process rather than, trying to avoid the temptation of going straight to the heart of structuring? Like, curious as from practical perspective.
Yeah, that's a good question, Gina. I think that the whole question of timing is critical, because the whole wisdom of when to introduce these topics and how, I think that a gentle introduction in young adulthood with maybe a sort of staging process of a greater involvement later on, I think can be a powerful mechanism. Because frankly, when you're 18, you might want to know some bare bones, but most 18-year-olds are more focused on other things. And so there does seem to be a sense in which looking to hold back full communication and not burdening really young adults with too much pressure and expectation, I think is one of the key learnings I've seen from families who do this well. And I think the whole question of allowing the rising generation to kind of take ownership of their role and schooling them in what that actually means, I think is the bit that seems to me to be the most transformational from the families who've done this well. And I do remember one story from a client who talked about being introduced as a young adult to what she described as the men in grey suits, who were the people who she felt these are the people who are now going to make decisions about my life and wealth, and I've never met them before, and they're people who I don't have a connection with. So I think the whole question of who conveys the message, how it's conveyed, and making it as personal and effective as possible, and with an end goal to allow the rising generation to feel that they have a seat at the table. Those to me are the sort of most important points that I see in terms of the families who are doing this well at the moment.
I'd love to explore with Garvin and Inika what their personal experience has been with this approach and in terms of prioritizing governance. Inika, would you like to kick off? I think you're muted, Inika.
Not anymore. Thank you, Gina. For me, well, I'm basically a tax and estate attorney. So typically, like John, one of the persons who was used to directly go into the structuring part. However, when I was still in my 20s, I would say I felt very cumbersome and also very too responsible. I found it too responsible to just do these structurings without talking with the people where the advice was of relevance for, but who were never at the table. So I started already from a very young age to ask let's say, the typical patriarch whether he would agree that all the other parties would also come to the table. And I found out at that age that in many instances, I would say 9 out of 10, all the expectations that were mentioned before did not seem to work out in the way they were formulated as a precondition of the advice. But that in the real life, all the expectations and ideas about qualities and wishes of the next generation did not turn out to be as the patriarch mentioned it to me. So that's one. The other thing, then of course, I started thinking about how to do this properly. For me, one of the very important tools to do that is talk about philanthropy. So philanthropy may be a very useful tool and topic to go into this process of a common strategy, creating a common strategy, a common vision on the future, common values, communicating, but also educating the very young generations. As of a very young age, you can also involve younger generations in philanthropic endeavors. Governance, of course, if you create philanthropic foundations, you can also add that to the governance possibilities of a family business. So you can move with people, involve them in several stages. So that's, for me, has been really a very effective and fruitful way of dealing with those issues before turning into, let's say, the hard tax and legal work.
Garvin, I think you've been in a unique role where you've worked hard within your own family to put an effective governance structure in place. I know you're going to talk a bit more about that experience later, but I just wondered, if anything resonated from what John and Inika have said that you wanted to share right now.
Yeah, I've actually been furiously taking notes, wishing I had heard them speak 15, 20 years ago. So yeah, I've retired as a chairman of my family's American public company a couple of years ago, and I did that for 14 years. And I'm fifth generation, and my brother's now our chair, Campbell Brown. We've got a non-family CEO. And my dad did not work in the business, just for whatever that's worth. And so yeah, a lot of things are springing to mind, and I think one of the themes in particular, or one of the debates that'll come up between generations, is the question that, I guess, as John framed it, it was allocation versus participation or something like that, which I think is a very diplomatic way to say, do you chop up the estate in an equal way across all cousins or siblings, regardless of the fact that maybe some of them are less engaged than others. And so, and that's sort of, employee versus non-employee family debates, which, by the way, touches quickly on compensation. Family who are not in a company will have opinions on the compensation of their relatives, and how those relatives receive feedback, for instance. What's the feedback culture at that business? Do they get, and are they held fully accountable? It's difficult to fire relatives. But everything I've just mentioned is related to an operating business, and not all these families under consideration will have operating businesses. As I think about the tensions in families, they're made better or worse by a couple of things I would pitch. Number one, obviously, if a founder owned and operated thing is totally a different beast, and the founder's the founder, and they can do whatever they like, as far as I'm concerned, or anyone's concerned. When you get into multi-generational and multi-branch families, it's different. I think you need to start flexing the governance muscles. I always recommended, and this will sound geeky and legalistic, but I when I was, 1920, read in some class something about John Rawls, who was a legal theorist at Harvard, and his theory of justice, and he uses something called a veil of ignorance, and if you put a veil of ignorance up between you and your position in society or your family, from behind that veil of ignorance, begin to design your own governance, so that you'll not bias the governance in some way towards your own situation. If you're an employee, if you're from whatever branch, et cetera, et cetera. And so I like the veil of ignorance as a base of play when you get into multi-generational, multi-branch families. So that's founders versus multi-gen, multi-branch. The other thing is it an operating business or a financial family? I think the latter, in some ways, is easier to deal with, because the family don't have responsibility over a P&L, a profit and loss statement. They're just sitting on an endowment, so to speak. And having a P&L in your life is a little more complicated. And then finally is the thing private or public. So if it's a private operating business, that's in some ways, again, it can be worse because the family is left to almost with too much power. And of course, I've got a bias because our business is public, but if you're public, you have the benefit of using the public markets as a governing tool, as a bad cop around the dining room table. And you need to worry about minority shareholder lawsuits. And so certainly when I was in the hot seat, I would always go on about the public. And then when you're with the public, you go on about the family. But I do think that being public can be a big help. And so, a purely financial private entity in some ways is the best, but in other ways it's the worst, because there are so few easily discoverable benchmarks that one can use to help to govern things. Anyway, rambling a bit right now, but those are my quick takes on that allocation versus participation debate.
Thank you. John, did you want to just say something? Go ahead.
Just a quick sort of point, Gina, and I think this is sort of for all of those out there who are, like Enrica and I, recovering tax lawyers, don't mention the T word too early would be one of my epithets. In other words, the feeling from the advisor's perspective is that rush to kind of bring in the structure and the complex issues is almost like instinctive. But if you overlay those on some of these complex issues, the comprehension of the family gets clouded. And so I think being clear about what you need to communicate and when the structure piece sort of comes in and how important it is to people when you're just trying to convey principles, I think it's a sort of hold back principle is a good one to observe until we've got comprehension and feedback that people actually say, I get the principles first. So principles first, structure second, I think is an important approach.
I just want to draw on something that Garvin said and ask Inika to comment on. So the question of who's your client is one that lawyers have to face all the time. And, you know, the temptation is whoever it is that's instructing you. And if you do have a founder that is still around and the one that's coming to you and saying, I need, you know, assistance with structuring. Inika, like, what is your thought in terms of, from an advisor perspective, to whom do you owe a duty of care if you are advising on and putting in solutions and structures that are intended to manage and preserve the wealth of that is benefiting more than just the founder, but you know, current generation and future generations to come?
Yeah. Well, that is often said to be an issue. However, I don't think, in my view, it should not be a real issue. Let's zoom a little bit out. And also, I would like to thank you, John, for setting the ground, because he mentioned several times, if you set a structure or set a family up to fail, and if that is the case, the question, of course, is for any lawyer, if failing is the result and you can anticipate that you're failing, are you doing a good job for your client? And then the question is who your client is. Well, I would assume that in nearly, well, all the situations of these family business owners that we're talking about, the interest also of your client is to serve the family system. There is no client I could imagine who does not maintain as his or her interest to sustain a good family cohesion and the ongoing maintenance of the family business. So if a client, let's typically refer to this client as the patriarch, has a culture of command, control, and driven by tax optimization, and is looking for structures supporting that culture, I think as an advisor, you have the duty to inform them that a culture of, as you mentioned, stewardship, which basically means collaboration, regeneration, and abundance, basically a culture that supports service, which means service to a bigger thing than just a private interest. That may be the family as a whole, the business as a whole, but even society as a whole, as another purpose to that. We know from all kind of research that this latter culture, the culture of stewardship, is the most successive culture in terms of long-term maintenance of family and business. You mentioned Dennis Jeffy. I think a very good reference is his book, Borrowed from Your Grandchildren. It's a study on what the typical features are of family businesses so it's not on family feuds and wars, but it's a study on the opposite. What are the typical features of families that are successful for longer than 100 years? So really long term. While we all know that most of the family business go down in a few generations. And you can summarize that book with the title. The culture of having merely borrowed the business from your grandchildren is decisive for its long-term success, which is the culture of stewardship. So if we know, and we should know, that this is the predominant vision of long-term success, we cannot, as lawyers, as tax advisors, accountants, notaries, whatever role we have in this advisory circus, we cannot ignore it. So the paradox here is that many clients who do wish to have control over the next generation and want to govern from their grave as well, and want to exercise control, in fact, are the more powerless on the long term. And I think it's our duty as advisors, as a whole, in whatever role, to make clear to our client what their enlightened self-interest in this regard is. So it is typically we're talking about what is the definition of the interest of the client. And so it should be a larger interest than the really narrow self-interest of the client to take care of the next generation. That's not longer the case. If you're planning for succession, it's not longer taking care, but you should inspire the next generation. I also think of another book written by Stephen Covey, very famous, Trust and Inspire. Every advisor can use that book in order to find the language to talk to their clients on this topic. So looking in my own jurisdiction, which is the Netherlands, I can see that in the ethical code of tax advisors, there's already a provision that mentions that, well, but this is code of conduct only, that we need to take into account in everything we do the interests of other stakeholders, whatever that may be. That obviously includes also younger generations, but even beyond other stakeholders. In the lawyers' organization, there's even included since a couple of years a provision that says quite ambiguously that all lawyers need to have an ethical attitude that is aspirational. Nobody knows exactly what that means. It's subject of debate, but still. However, this is only code of conduct. I would say there is a stronger case that the duty of care, which is a legal duty of care, should include here that if advisors set up to fail, in the words of John, and should know that they are setting up to fail, may be considered liable to the clients. And then the question is who exactly the client is. Well, that may be the inheritors of the ultimate client, the original client, because they step in the contractual rights and obligations of the contract that you have with a lawyer or a tax advisor or a notary. And that is a whole new perspective, because we are talking already on this topic for, I think, more than 20 years, John and I at least, and some others, but nothing is really changing. So if I look around, most of the advisors in the room are still doing the same thing. And that is, but in the meanwhile, the whole society is changing. And the differences between the generations are also changing, and the younger generation is not the same as we had 20 years ago. So this is certainly something that is that all the lawyers and tax advisors have to take into account. To put it in other words, top-down advising is a risk, and it should be bottom up. And if you can't do it, there's another thing that should be mentioned here. If you can't do it because you don't know how to do it, but there's also the issue of conflict of interest. Every advisor has a conflict of interest. Nobody can say there is not, because if you're confronted with a client today that is not ready for a transaction in this year, and you're looking for the turnover of the transaction, if the family is not ready for it because you need to do your groundwork first, then you have, as an ethical lawyer, but also in the legal sense, in the duty of care, you have to restrict yourself and reach out to other professional advisors who can do the other work if you don't feel up to that.
I would love to ask John and Garvin if they have what their views are on what you've just shared, and I just want to frame it also in a slightly different way too. I mean, if you have a family that is in its early stages, as a first generation, so the skills and practices that were put in place by the founder that enabled them to succeed, surely, as Garvin alluded to, are very different than when you're dealing with a fifth generation family, whatever the context is, that are dealing with multiple family owners, multiple businesses, multiple structures. So I think about that as you talk, Ineke, because when you're talking about the responsibility to set the family up for success and to look at the family interest more broadly, that tells me that there needs to be some flexibility and an adaptability that's required for the advice that you give, for the structures, the solutions that you put in place. So I just would love to hear what John and Garvin think about the points that you've raised, which are perhaps a little bit more contentious in our world, but I think are very important.
Sure. Well, I mean, I think there are a number of, I do endorse what Inika said, but I think if there are a number of different ways of looking at this. One is, and forgive me for an English analogy, but in seeking a yardstick of how we measure the long-term effectiveness of what we do in this area, I've reminded of a famous British landscape gardener, Capability Brown, and he set out landscapes in people's, landed estates and envisioned what they would look like in 100 years. But he never lived to see the fruits of his work. So taking a slightly, kind of very long range view, it seems to me that the ultimate test of how successful we are in this area may not be measured in our own lifetimes, because the vision of successful transition through, say, 1 or 2 generations is to me inspiring and something that gets me out of bed in the morning in terms of the ultimate challenge. But we won't know in our lifetimes whether we've succeeded in some of this work. And so I think that in speaking truth unto power, if I can call it like that, to the sort of the very powerful first generation founder, it seems to me that the design of governance that we need to think about is one that is sort of contextualized by the generation. In other words, a founder generation model is useless when the founder's gone. And so I see it really more in terms of, if you think of a relay race where that baton is passed, inculcating in the founder to say that this is only going to work long term if your children or grandchildren, whatever, take ownership, and you provide them with the means to oversee this properly. That's the way to sort of convey to founders to say, well, you can't reach beyond the grave, and supervision and governance and monitoring, in the absence of that, the chaos reigns, really. So I think that in that context, there are a lot of different ways of communicating the principles that Inika's conveyed in a way that is more palatable and effective, to particularly controlling founders, to say, look, the reason we're saying this is because of all these factors that are militating against success, and there's so much writing on that, and being able to point to the positive role models that we've been talking about, I think is very strong. So for these reasons, I think it's the communication strategy with the founder, with the senior generation, needs to be equally sort of well poised and thought through as it does with the rising generation, to be able to do this well.
Just to dive in on a very specific thing that came up earlier between the two of them, and then I'll get more general, which is just on when to introduce this stuff to kids. Can I just remind us? I mean, there's, a lot of what we're talking about is succession planning. But contingency planning is something different. That's when someone gets hit by a bus. And so just by the law of contingency planning, it needs to be done at the age of 18. Assuming that's, when in whatever jurisdiction people are sitting in, that's when children become adults. And so if 18-year-olds don't know what happens in a contingency planning situation, we're all in trouble. Can I move on to a little bit of the how to do some of this stuff? And I thought that Inika's mention of foundations is worth going back to. I feel like, I think, look, good governance structures, and as John said, structure comes after principles. The question is sort of how do you build out those structures, and then how does the next gen take on the skill sets to staff those structures and to be good at them and to learn how to become stewards. And I think foundations and or non-core activity committees, so not the main board and not the kind of trust advisory board or whatever it might be, but just some sort of a committee in the ecosystem. And I think ideally a foundation, it could be a small foundation, but that's the Trojan horse to teach the next gen the skill set to become good stewards. Because foundations and anything that's community facing suddenly introduces the concept of stakeholding, and stakeholders, not just shareholders. And I think that that's a gem of a concept for the average 18 to 25-year-old to begin to get their head around. Look, you're going to think we're crazy, but I mean, we introduce stuff when kids are 6, 7, 8 years old. But we have an operating business, and so it's easy to and it's a tactile, well, it's a drinks business, so obviously we can't introduce alcohol, but we can introduce grains. We can have them learning, the difference between corn and wheat and rye, and looking at empty bottles and filling them up and taking those things home as souvenirs, an empty bottle full of grains at the age of 8. And so we were very deliberate, I have to say, and put our marketing brains focused on this for the 6th generation. And but the once people are sort of 18-ish, that there can be committees set up for 18 to 25-year-olds. They can be given foundation budgets where they do meet people from the community, and presto, they feel a sense of responsibility. And then the other thing, it's not just the community, by the way, it's the company. So by Delaware, statutes, company directors have fiduciary duty, not just to the shareholders, but also to the company. And the company includes employees, and employees are from the community, and companies have suppliers, and those suppliers are in the community. And so that ethic of having a duty to the company, to the asset, I think is also one that is a Trojan horse to teach stewardship. It's not just about shareholding.
I just wanted to jump in, Garvin, because I think you may have addressed Ali's question, which is if the ability is provided for a founder to simulate structured entities with a governance model to prepare generational family members to take ownership of wealth, would this be helpful? And I think you've been answering that with some examples of different ways that you can create opportunities to teach these lessons.
And then the double-edged sword in these wonderful entities to teach stewardship is that they're also these platforms are also audition opportunities. They are stages for cousins to audition in front of management, independent directors, audition in front of each other, audition in front of the older generation. And auditions can go, well, and they can go less well. And so it's sort of, buckling the chin strap, so to speak, and hopping on stage and auditioning. And the good news of that, and again, it can come with a bit of heartbreak, is that suddenly, the next gen's in the talent funnel, and they are auditioning, so that 10 years hence, the system will have a better idea as to what the bench of talent looks like.
Garvin, can I ask you a question? Just at the thinking about the sort of frustrations of rising generation and whatever, and handing on the baton. Do you have in your model compulsory retirement ages for senior family members? Because I've seen sometimes when I raise that, that meets with some resistance from founders sometimes normally accept themselves, but the idea that you recognize a need to make way as the senior generation, it seems to me, is a sort of a sign of maturity. But have you built that into your own family model in terms of what age do people stop being involved? I mean, in governance, not in management and oversight. Because obviously you mentioned you've stepped down as chairman. Was that as a result of a compulsory rule or a discretionary decision on your part?
It was the latter, but to be fair, I was trying to model good governance. I mean, I was
Yeah.
52 and very happy, and things going pretty well, quite frankly. But years earlier, the CEO and I worked on a plan for him and for me, and we thought it would be clever to play whack-a-mole. That once he gets replaced after 2-3 years, that I should make way as well. Otherwise, the family chair needs to sit there for another duration of a CEO and then look for the third replacement and so on and so forth. And at some level, you really, hopefully, we have a culture of not believing one's own press, so that you do make room after a certain time. And we do have, actually, I'll stand corrected. I don't think it's in our bylaws, but certainly in the minutes, for independent directors on the board, it would be a 15-year term limit.
Right. Yeah.
Versus an S&P 500 average of 8.7, and the UK is 9 years. And then for family members, we would encourage, for non-management family members on the board, we would encourage a 5 to a 9-year term to make room.
Okay, that's really interesting, because I was talking in another context to somebody who was a very sort of successful private equity investor, and he said there was a negative correlation between the longer the duration of board holdings, the performance level of companies sometimes was negatively correlated with duration. And so that whole question of turnover and being prepared to look to pass on, I think is a it's a challenging thing. And I guess the thing I found quite difficult to sometimes work through is this idea of 2 generations in harness together. Because how do you build a culture of equality rather than deference of junior to rising to senior generation? Do you manage to solve that in your family association in terms of how you sort of bring the 2 generations together in a sort of a neutral way rather than in a hierarchical way?
When I was dealing with the 4th generation, my parents' generation, I always said, all of this good governance work that we're doing for the future is what we're all going to live by, except that I will continue to show up on the doorstep of all members of the 4th generation, and manage them as appropriate. I just, at some level, the older generation in a family, depending on how the shares frack out, you just need to hopefully make exceptions. But as a family grows, using an arch metaphor, there's eventually, hopefully there's no longer a keystone sitting in the middle of the arch, which would be the founder, and so that if a stone or two falls out of the arch stands. And so hopefully that's what you get. Sorry, Inika, I know you could.
Well, I just wanted to add, we talked about foundations as a mechanism to educate younger generations, but I've also used it to educate elder generations. We all know that some people have difficulties in letting go and making place for the next generation, even though they should. And it helps if you have a foundation in place where other, more stakeholder stewardship activities, whether charitable or not, are being performed. It helps if you can move somebody to a very honorful position in a foundation where he or she has another intensity of acting, but can be very useful, and can also be a very friendly and empathetic way to accommodate people who are becoming more older. I even wanted to compare it with some political situations, but I will not. So that is also a very useful thing. And I'm not sure, the other thing I was thinking about when you were talking, and I wanted to ask you, but I don't know whether I interrupt the scheme of Gina, is, in my mind, it's very important for families, if you're talking about good governance, is to be really good in making good conflicts, to celebrate conflicts, rather than walk away from it, and which most families do. Most people do. Most people have tendency of walking away from tensions and conflicts, and that's absolutely what they should not do. So what do you think about that?
I think the Dutch are good at that.
Yeah, that's right. Not all of them.
Yeah.
I'm half Canadian. We find that very awkward.
Yeah. Yeah.
But no, I think you're right. And to be, so we, yes, and the line that we warmed to eventually is something called diplomatic candor. So
Oh.
to be honest with each other, but be diplomatic, you know, no sense in making it any worse.
That is certainly something the Dutch are not good at.
There was a question that was raised earlier on that I think ties into this around, and it was directed to John, but I think it applies to what each of you are saying. You know, how much time do you typically spend with the family on these principles before, you know, getting into the structuring piece? What I'm hearing from these comments is that because of interpersonal dynamics and relationships, it sounds to me like this is really an ongoing discussion, and that conflicts are going to arise, people's needs are going to change, dynamics will evolve. And therefore, I would love to hear how each of you would approach constructing an effective governance framework that facilitates an ongoing check-in around the dynamics between family members that can continue to support the system.
Sure. Should I go? So I think, to me, Gina, in thinking about grounding an effective governance framework, using a point that Ineke made earlier about bottom up rather than top down, I'm a big fan of articulating a standing agenda that spells out very clearly exactly what is expected and with what frequency and who is responsible. And so with one client recently who's, you know, because I think you get all of your best ideas from super smart clients, and as consultants we just get to sort of basically share our clients' good ideas with other clients anonymously. that's the fun of what we do. But I think thinking very carefully about the interplay between different governance meetings, and in this particular example we had a trust involved, but you know, a family committee, a governance committee, independent persons, how those interlock, the meeting pack that goes out in advance, the action points. To me, a good governance framework is one that isn't just, oh, we turn up once a quarter and have a little fireside chat. It actually does spell out roles and responsibilities, works on the basis of hitting all of the sort of sensitive topics. And to the point we were saying about, you know, diplomacy, you know, having once a year saying to everyone, well, are you still in for this? And, you know, what's our bench depth like in reserves and things like that. So those sort of very nitty gritty points to me are core. Another thing that Garvin said, which I think is very interesting about contingency planning versus succession planning, is that teaching clients the difference of that. And I remember one client who's a physicist who basically every time he thinks about his will, he says, well, statistically, the probability of this being my last will is pretty low unless I, you know, get hit by a number 8 bus or have a heart attack. And so that whole question about the provisionality of most planning and governance to say, this is what happens if I die tomorrow, but over the next 20 years, if I do this right, I'll have probably transitioned most of these things. And so that whole sense that it isn't a static process that you make a plan and then put it in the drawer for 15 years, and therefore it's an ongoing process of communication and transition. That sort of insight in terms of the sort of overall approach, I think, is critical to building a good framework.
Yeah. I agree. I also find the difference between contingency and succession planning very insightful, because talking again about the T word, of course, many people around the world, around Europe at least, do have a strong wish to transfer a business to the next generation. The sooner the sooner than later, because of the fact that the very generous tax exemptions we have for transfer of businesses to the next generation are likely to be reduced in the coming years due to all kind of feelings in politics about reducing. Well, inequality, of course, is the concern there, and that is certainly going to happen. So people want to make use of it right now, today, and you can even consider that as a form of contingency. I think the exemptions, talking about my country, are so enormous that for any entrepreneur, it is a topic that you cannot ignore. I mean, it is at the front of everybody's head to talk about this, and so you can consider that as a contingency in a way. However, that's not the end of the story. And answering the question of Gina, I often say, and of course, there is no one size fits all to this. Every family is different. We're talking about culture of a family. There can be all kind of latent conflicts that need to be resolved before you can do a proper governance planning. But I tend to say, think more about 5 years, because we're talking about a transformation. Because that is really, that may sound very long, but if that is, it is also a kind of sticker effect. If people start thinking about 5 years, then they also start planning for something in 5 years. So it helps them also to have different thoughts about this, rather than, okay, I have to do something, go to a notary, do a transaction, and then it's it. No, you can do that as a sort of contingency, but then you still have to do the framework, the foundational work in order to have a succession planning.
Gervin, you've put an effective governance plan into place for your family and an ecosystem. And you've mentioned you've developed this farm metaphor that has been helpful. Would you care to spend a few minutes sharing what's worked from your perspective?
As I listen to all today, there are two topics. One is just trusts and how to manage, the stewardship of shares, which would be top of mind for me, or financial assets. And I'm not, and at the end of the day, look, that requires proper legal work, and there's just no getting around it. And so that feels the management of the transition rather of generational wealth requires hard-nosed legal work, period. My metaphor about the farm is a better one for governance and for, I think, shareholder expectations of an operating business, or next gen expectations of one's parents and how they may steward their piece of pie. And so I would hope that at the end of the day, that a family looks at their assets as a farm or as an estate, and thinks long and hard about the fertility of that soil for generations, and doesn't, spray too many pesticides on it in year one to get a bumper crop. I mean, maybe that's kind of over planning, so to speak, so that, you might have a great year one and take a big holiday altogether, but not much happening on year, 4 or 5. And that the older generation would apply this metaphor to something like dividend policy, and i.e. make sure that they reinvest in the business first before paying out dividends. And when it comes to dividends, keeping the payout ratio reasonable, and not sort of 80% of free cash flow or whatever it might be, not getting too wound up about dividend yield, etc. So I just think that managing a farm and keeping the fields fertile for the long term, knowing when to let fields lay fallow, how to invest in even some organic practices so that the fertility of the soil is long lasting. In our case, we actually have a foundation in Kentucky and Tennessee that focuses on soil, wood, water, and grain, which are obviously the key components of in a bottle of whiskey. And on the grain side, we're focused on rye because it contributes to soil health, so that the other grains that we grow, have a better shot at staying in our region long term, so we don't have to import them from other jurisdictions and raise the carbon footprint of those inputs. And so that's the kind of farm metaphor that I warm to. If an advisor is looking for a way to pitch a client, whether it's the parent or the next gen, on why this work is so important, I find it a less emotive metaphor to use.
You're on mute, Gina.
Sorry about that. It's always useful to share practical tools that you use in your own work. And this goes to some of the questions that have been put on the screen, like what crucial questions that you should ask clients. But I know each of you have exercises or toolkits that you go to facilitate these conversations, to inspire your clients and the families you support to think about topics that are going to help inform the process of, be it governance and then subsequently structuring. So I'd like to invite you to share one example of a practical exercise that is a go-to for you. And maybe I will ask Ineke to start.
Okay, thanks, Gina. What I do is proposing a client to think, as a hypothetical scenario, of course, of a radical stewardship structure. And with a radical stewardship structure, I mean the transfer of the assets, the business normally, to a perpetual foundation. So in a way that they don't own the assets anymore. And the next question would be, under what conditions would you be willing to do that? Of course, the answer would be involved, because then you also know, because the first question always is, how important is the business for this family? Why does this family has this business, and why should future generations still have this business? That's really the first question you need to address. And if they really consider the business as their first child, as John mentioned, then they would be willing to, very likely to be willing to maintain the business rather than own it. So it's a hypothetical scenario, but it makes many things very clear. And in terms of communication, of course, you cannot say which questions do you ask in general, because it's very, very much dependent on the clients. But what I would like to add here is, if people say things, clients always say many things. What I use is my mediation techniques and negotiation. I have been trained in Harvard on negotiation. Everybody can go there. That's very fruitful for everything you do. So if there is somebody from a younger generation who says, I want to be the CEO, just a stupid example, it's not interesting that he's saying something like that. The only thing that counts is why. What is the background of this kind of positions? So you really have to ask abundantly. And you have to do it in a free way so that people are able to speak out what their underlying interests are. That's why we also talking in this webinar about balancing interests. It's about interests, not on points that the positions taken. We're not talking about the positions taken, but on the interests that are behind that. So it's really a question of communication also with your client abundantly, and asking hypotheticals and see how they react is a very good start, because then you have a lot of more information and you can also create other hypotheticals. The other one John already mentioned is the dynastic imaging. So suppose that your business will survive another 100 years. How would you like that it is looking at? And what would be the shape of the business? What would be the shape of the family? And if you think of it really big, you know, how should it look like? How should all these people relate to each other, interact with each other? And then it's like, you know, building a castle. You don't. So that's a nice metaphor as well. If you build a castle, you go as an architect. You start with, how am I going to use this castle? What will be the different purposes of the different rooms, and how does it suit the welfare of the inhabitants? You don't start with how the pipes will be unfolding in this building, right? So that's really what you do. You begin with the end of mind, and then we have again Stephen Covey.
Before I hand over to John, there was a question, if any of you have worked with the 3-circle model tool for advising business families, and well, Garvin's shaking his head. So when you share your practical exercise, perhaps you can share also what your experience is with working with that model in exploring potential conflicts of interest. John, but do you want to go ahead, Garvin? Because you're
yeah.
Oh.
Okay, well, look, it's actually very apropos. Look, I'm assuming that model is sort of company, or in our case, we used to do family board company as the 3 overlapping circles, and to try and frack out, in effect, what in the overlap zones, how those things work together and how they're all different from each other. And actually, I use the model in pitching why I should get out of my job as well, and sort of succession planning. And look, here's anyway. What I was going to suggest, my bag of tricks, Gina, actually still relates to the 3-circle model, because it was in those circles, when they overlap, there can be conflict. And so what I mean, it's going to sound crazy, but I mean, look, I had a speaking coach, wonderful woman in London, actually, and with her, she found an actor to help me practice conflict. So back Innica, we did do conflict, and having an actor, you know, as a young person at the time, you know, 40-ish, you know, dealing with a bunch of intimidating gray suits, it's just a great. I mean, it was a real help to be able to go back and practice again. You know, as children, we're all allowed to practice sports, you know, 5 days a week and before game day. Now you're an adult, but you're not allowed to practice. And as you're doing the most important thing on the planet. So I would, if advisors out there, if in your network you can find a speaking coach, and better yet, an actor to help your clients talk to each other, please do it. I mean, it really helped me out. But there were other good parts of the 3 circles too, I promise.
John, what is in your goodie bag of tools?
Yeah, nothing really rocket science here. I think one thing which again is incredibly obvious, but particularly with businesses, is get out of your office and go and see the family where they are, and particularly with a founder, see them in their business setting, to understand, get under the skin of that. You know, I think that's really, really important to do, and spend a bit of time just seeing the family interact socially as well, to understand some of the dynamics and how they sort of are with each other. So I think that's one. The other is, I think, this sort of whole, you know, analytical framework of trying to start with this sort of framework of allocation governance, and only bring the sort of more formal part to the table at the appropriate time. To me, that's critical, because we're sort of almost pre-trained as lawyers to kind of start drafting the trust or the letter of wishes or the will. And in hierarchical terms, I mean, I think it's an over-repeated phrase, but that whole thing about culture eats structure for breakfast, which is apparent to me very powerfully. So just be convinced of the limitations of the written document and spend more time than you think you need to in the interpersonal relationships. Not that we become somehow sort of coaches or whatever, but just think about how that operates as well, because that dynamic and the governance piece is critical. And I do think that the insight that a good independent person in some governance role can really leaven things out and really help. And so the idea that impartiality, that if you can find a person who can gain the confidence of the family, like a non-exec type role in a company who is seen as impartial, so you don't populate all the governance with purely family members, but have this sort of blend of independents who the family choose, but then who have currency and can earn the respect of the family. To me, that's critical for functional governance and building confidence, because as Inika said, conflict's going to happen. Somebody needs to be able to go into the room and listen to people, and they want to feel heard. And if there are sort of family complexities there, knowing you've been heard by an independent person and a decision been taken, it may not go your way, but at least it's been put on the table. And to me, those are the sort of things I would tend to focus on in terms of trying to get a proper process going.
I can add one thing, what I tend to use as a model, as a system. What I find very useful is to have some more understanding of family systems. Family systems knowledge is basically, you can summarize that as considering the system. So we're talking about a system, a family dynamics, and you can make that very clear by asking yourself, what is the relate? So we're talking as lawyers and so on, we're talking about persons. But more interesting from this systemic perspective is the relationship between those persons. So what is the quality of the relationship between each and every person? And if you can make a scheme of that. So all the persons involved, and then you make connections between the persons, how these qualities work out. And for me, it works very well if I start to speak with somebody who is, let's say, out of the core of the center of the family, somebody who is more or less the outsider. There's always more or less an outsider. If you start to speak with them, then you will learn the most about how the system works, because they have very good observations on how the system works. That's why they are the outsider. And if you can more or less color the quality of the relationships within the family, then you are ahead of the curve and can do a lot of more very appropriate questions, and you're much more closer to the design of all the things that you need to do before structuring. Perhaps it's a bit abstract, but for me it's very practical.
Thank you, Inika. We're coming up towards the end of this session. I think that one of the things that I'm taking away from this discussion is greater awareness of, I think, the increasing complexity of planning today, and the need to take a more holistic approach dealing with family dynamics, intergenerational priorities, needs, and societal needs, and just challenges that extend well beyond the myopic focus of a tax plan structure or a succession plan structure. And that what I'm also hearing is that different levels of expertise are probably useful in this process. and that this is an ongoing process. It's not something to be done at the beginning and dusted. And thank you very much. Now we've got rigid structures in place. They need to also be fluid and evolve as families progress. So it's a discussion that we could, I'm sure, continue for many more hours. I want to take a moment to thank Ineke, Garvin, and John for your sharing your wisdom and insights with us today. I'd like to also thank all of the attendees who have joined. We're going to be showing a screen shortly that gives you a reference to certain resources that the STEP Thought Leadership and Special Interest Groups have produced. There's an online feedback form also that will appear on your screen once the webinar finishes. We'd be super grateful if you would complete this, as it does help STEP with planning future events. It'll also be sent to you by email tomorrow, along with a link to the webinar of to the recording of the webinar. I'd like to thank everyone for attending, and I hope that you found today's session to be of interest and benefit. Thank you so much, everyone. Goodbye.
Thank you, Gina.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye.